Assalamu alaikum viewers, welcome to episode 14 of ISO 9001 2015 series, and in this episode we'll be discussing about clause number 8, which is operation. Clause 8 is divided into 7 subclauses. 8.1 is about operational planning and control. 8.2 is about requirements for products and services. 8.3 is about design and development of products and services. 8.4 is about control of externally provided processes, products and services. 8.5 is about production and service provision. 8.6 is about release of products and services, and 8.7 is about control of non-conformity. Before we enter into this particular clause, I would like to remind you regarding two basic approaches which we discussed earlier. One is process approach, and the other one is risk-based thinking. And both of these approaches they were identified in clause 4.4, where 4.4 says that you need to identify the processes and you need to identify the risk and opportunities related to those processes. And once you identify those processes and identify the relevant risk and opportunities, then you need to develop appropriate actions and controls, and you need to develop appropriate monitoring and measurement, and you need to develop a mechanism of correction and corrective action. And to implement these things effectively, according to clause 7, you have to provide appropriate resources and you need to maintain those resources. So when we talk about process and process approach and risk-based thinking, they are identified in clause 4.4, and risk-based thinking is further explained in clause 6.1. But when it comes to actions and controls, although in clause 4.4 it is identified, although it is identified in clause 6.1, but this particular clause, clause number 8, is basically covering that particular area in more detail, and it is talking about actions and controls. So that's basically the crux of the matter, that we have to implement process approach and risk-based thinking effectively. And one of the component of process approach and risk-based thinking is effective actions and controls, which we'll be discussing in this particular clause. All right, so let's have a quick look once again at clause number 8. There are 7 subclauses, but keep in mind that clause 8.1, which is operational planning and control, this is one of the most important clauses or subclauses within this clause 8, because this particular clause is talking in general about all the processes. So whatever processes you have, whether you have production process, whether you have procurement process, whether you have sales process or you have marketing process or you have HR process or you have design process. So that particular clause is talking about all those processes. It is referring back to clause 4.1, where a standard requires you to identify all the processes which are basically contributing in your quality management system. And then once you identify those processes, then you need to develop appropriate operational controls. So this particular clause 8.1 is talking about all those processes which are identified within your organization. So they might be in hundreds. So you might have identified hundreds of processes which are needed to fulfill the requirements of your products or services. So that's extremely important clause. Many people believe that it's a general clause and they don't take it seriously. They focus more on those clauses which are very specific, like clause 4 from clause 8.2 to clause 8.7. They are very specific clauses. Some key processes which are generally available in all the organizations, they are identified there, and specific requirements are identified related to contract review process, related to design and development process, related to procurement process, related to production and service provision process, related to the delivery process, release of the products and services process, or related to the process relevant to control of non-conformity handling. But those specific requirements are for those specific processes which are highlighted within the standard. But clause 8.1 is covering all the processes, those processes which are identified from clause 8.2 to clause 8.7, and those processes which are not identified between clause 8.2 to 8.7. For example, contract review process is there in clause 8.3, but 8.2. But when it comes to, for example, some other process which is not identified there, for example, marketing process. So marketing process is not there in between clause 8.2 to 8.7, but you will be considering marketing process if it is an important process for your organization. According to clause 8.1, you will be considering this process and you will establish appropriate controls. So similarly, maybe many other processes you have which are not specifically identified from 8.2 to 8.7, but those processes will be requiring your control. Those processes will be requiring appropriate actions. And this requirement is identified in clause 8.1. Clause 8.1 is quite a straightforward clause, and most of the requirements are quite straightforward, and I will not be going in too much detail of them. It says that the organization shall plan, implement, and control the processes which are definitely identified in clause 4.4, needed to meet the requirements for the provision of products and services and to implement the actions determined in clause 6 by following actions. So, first of all, keep in mind that the processes, according to the process approach, very first thing you have to do, you have to identify the processes which are needed for the quality management system. And that requirement is defined in clause 4.4. So we are giving reference to clause 4.4 because of that reason, because from clause 4.4, we come to know that what are those processes which we are supposed to control. And according to clause 6, we are identifying what are the risks related to those processes. So collectively, both the processes and the relevant risks, once they are in front of us, then we are supposed to establish appropriate controls, which are given. The list is given here. So first of all, we have to determine the requirements related to the products and services. So it doesn't matter whether you are talking about which process, whether you're talking about production process, or you're talking about procurement process, or you're talking about delivery process, or you're talking about maybe the storage process. Whatever process you are talking about, first of all, you need to know what are the requirements related to products and services. So maybe there are requirements from the customer side, maybe there are certain legal requirements. And so as an organization, the very first thing we need to make sure that we are aware of the requirements, and that's what part A is demanding from us. Once you are aware of the product and service requirements, you are very clear that what customer wants, and you are very clear that what the legal bodies requires from you. The second thing, because you have already identified the processes, the second thing which you have to do is to identify the criteria related to those processes and the acceptance criteria of products and services. So how you need to run a particular process, how you need to manage a particular process. If it's a production process, what will be the working environment in that particular production process. You need to understand and identify how the machines will be set, how the people will be working there, what will be the steps of activities. So you need to identify the criteria for process, how the processes will be managed, and the criteria related to the acceptance of products and services. So while you are establishing the criteria for processes and acceptance criteria for the product and services, at the same time you need to make sure that resources are determined, because what sort of manpower you require, what sort of qualification you require, what sort of machinery you require, what sort of finances you require, what sort of let's say equipments you require, what sort of calibration you require, what sort of maintenance you require. So that's the time, because when you establish these controls, you need to make sure that the required resources are established, they are identified, and they are provided and they are maintained. So, according to clause C, standard is saying that determining the resources needed to achieve the conformity to the products and service requirements. Once everything is done, the process criteria that is defined, the acceptance criteria is defined, and the resources are available, the manpower is available, machine is available, equipment is available, everything is ready. Then the requirement D demands you to make sure the effective implementation of those controls which you have identified, implementation of that criteria which you have identified. So this is the part of implementation, and once you go for implementation, you need to make sure that implementation is effective. The next clause is related to documentation requirements. Clause number E says determining and maintaining and retaining the documented information to the extent necessary to have confidence that the processes have been carried out as per plan, and to demonstrate the conformity of products and services to their requirements. So keep in mind, many people say that ISO doesn't believe in documentation because ISO is not giving a lot of requirements related to documentation. But wherever it's needed by the organization, wherever the customer requires documentation, wherever the legal bodies requires documentation, and wherever you feel as a client, as an organization, that documentation is needed to provide confidence to your organization that you are meeting the requirements and you are fulfilling the requirements and needs and expectations of relevant stakeholders, at that point in time the requirement is that you have to determine what documentation is needed. So there are two types of documented information. One are the documents, and the other ones are records. So you need to decide what sort of documents you need to establish For example, do we require a procedure? Do we require a policy? Do we require a manual? Do we require a work instruction? Do we require a job description? Do we require a process map? Do we require a flow chart? So all these different types of documents, you will be deciding that whether you require them or not to provide the confidence to your organization. And similarly, the records, you will decide that what sort of records, other than those which are specifically identified within the standard, you will decide for these processes that what sort of records to be maintained, whether they should be maintained in form of hard copy, whether they should be maintained in the system, whether they should be maintained in the cloud. So you need to decide that how those records will be generated, how they will be maintained, how you will make sure that they are legible. There might be certain requirements from the customers, there might be certain requirements from the legal bodies, but most importantly, you will be requiring those records. You will be deciding that what records are needed by your organization to maintain such confidence. The next requirement is again extremely important. This is related to changes, because in most of the organizations we see that the changes are happening on regular basis. Some of them are planned changes, and some of them are unplanned changes. But in both cases, organizations are not really evaluating the risk related to those changes. So this particular clause requires you that the organization shall control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking the actions to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. So the important thing is, if you are having some changes which are already planned and you know that it will happen, you need to identify the risk related to these changes. What will be the impact on those processes? What will be the impact on legal requirements? What will be the impact on customer satisfaction? What will be the impact on financial resources? So you need to identify the risk and then take appropriate actions to avoid those risks. Similarly, when you are bringing these changes, maybe there might be some positive consequences, or maybe some opportunities are there. Think about those opportunities and take actions to grab those opportunities. Similarly, there might be some unintended changes, like you were not planning something, but something suddenly happened, like COVID-19 came, nobody planned for it. It came right in front of you, and you have to face the consequences. So once there are changes which are unplanned, unintended, definitely you need to study once again that what are the impacts on the process, what are the impacts on the resource, what are the impacts on manpower, what are the impacts on customer requirements, and what are the impacts on legal requirements. And then definitely once you have those impacts in front of you, you need to identify and take appropriate actions to avoid any risk and grab any opportunities which are in front of you. Now, one last point, which is extremely important, where a standard is talking about the outsourced processes. So maybe there are a few activities which are basically under your responsibility, but you have outsourced it to somebody else. Maybe because of the financial reasons, maybe because you have a sister concerned company which is performing such activities, or maybe because of the competencies and capabilities. Maybe your organization is not having capability of design and development, but you got the contract where design and development comes under your responsibility so you outsource the process to somebody else. But even if you outsource your process to somebody else, still you are responsible, because contractually you are liable for those activities. So if something goes wrong, at the end of the day you are accountable. So the standard is talking about those processes that the organization shall ensure that outsourced processes are also controlled. So 8.1, where it talks about all those processes which you are managing within your organization, you need to establish appropriate controls, you need to effectively implement, you need to make sure provision of resource, you need to make sure that appropriate controls are established and effectively implemented. At the same time, standard is demanding that you need to make sure that the outsourced processes are also appropriately controlled. So how do you control them? Whether you ask them to write procedures and you will approve them, or you give them the procedures and documentation to follow, or you perform regular inspections, or you perform regular testings, or you perform regular audits, it's totally up to your organization. It's totally up to the need of your organization. You need to define, you need to implement, and you need to make sure that those processes are effectively controlled. So it's already around 15 minutes of discussion about clause number 8, and we have still only covered clause 8.1. But we will end our discussion for this episode here. And we will start our next episode with clause 8.2. Thank you very much for watching and see you in the next episode.